welcome to Apologetics 101. I am your host, Christian apologist Brian Keith Bowen, here today with another very special video series. But this one's going to be in particular because this is not going to have an end in sight per se. It's just kind of going to be open-ended so that it'll allow for other videos to be made of it. It's gonna have more than one part, but it's just gonna be open-ended. I don't know how many videos I'm gonna make in it. I may continue it as I see fit, but it's not gonna have a last video per se, and I'm gonna work on other stuff while doing this. But every single time I do a video concerning this particular topic matter, this will be under the same banner. In this case, what we're discussing today is the arguments of Matt Dillahunty. Now, you wonder why I do an entire video series just on the arguments of Matt Dillahunty. Matt Dillahunty is a very influential atheist on the internet, and he's very popular, and he does a lot of debates, and he's got a lot of influence, but he's got really good rhetorical ability. And I mean that positively. He does have very good rhetorical ability. I'm not blaming him for that or criticizing him for that. I have good rhetorical ability. But sometimes when people, especially other atheists that supports his views, sees his rhetorical ability, they get blindsided by his rhetorical ability, and they don't see the arguments behind them. They don't see how bad the arguments are. And, the arguments could be really bad, but he could be articulating them very well because he has good rhetorical ability. And as a result, he could come off sounding very convincing especially to someone who already supports his position like another atheist. And what this series wants to do is basically get past that rhetorical ability that blindsides so many people, because most people aren't really trained in philosophy. My experience is that most people aren't trained in philosophy. Most people are not trained in good philosophical reasoning, and they may not know how to evaluate an argument. Or if they do, they could be they might not realize that in debating, you look at the kinds of arguments that the person present, not the way he presents them, but the kind of argument that he presents. Rhetorical ability has to do with a person's skill, their ability to articulate words for the purpose of convincing somebody or articulate an argument. And rhetorical ability is a good thing to have. I'm not blaming him for that. Like I said, I have rhetorical ability. But in order to understand who wins a debate or who had the better argument, you look at the argument, you evaluate the argument, you examine the content of what he's presenting. Okay? That's how you determine that. You don't determine it from how good of a debater that person just happens to be. There are a lot of good debaters out there, but that doesn't mean we agree with them all. We have to look at the arguments. We have to look at the evidence. We have to look at what's being presented. And I think that's very, very important. But unfortunately, a lot of people don't have that kind of training, don't have that kind of knowledge. And what ends up happening is that they end up getting blindsided by Matt's rhetorical ability, by his ability to be able to articulate an argument or to word something in a way that would convince somebody. And because he's very skilled at that, and as a result, someone could easily be blindsided by that and not look at the arguments. And that's bad, because you'll be fooled by a person's ability to word his arguments in a way that would sound convincing, especially someone who already supports his position in the first place. And by the way, I've got a little bit of a cold still, and I might cough a little bit in the background. Alright, I'm going to be doing, this time around, particular video, I'm going to be doing a PowerPoint presentation on one of Matt Dillahunty's most prized arguments, his claims not evidence argument, which is what I'm going to start this video series off with. I might be doing a video soon on his epistemology specifically as well. That will also be under the same banner. Oh, by the way, for the record, I have no personal problem with Matt Dillahunty. But my issue is not over Matt himself. My issue is over his arguments and the kind of because he has great influence in the internet. Uh, uh, he's very popular among atheists, and his rhetorical ability could easily blindside somebody in knowing the truth about a person's arguments. My goal is truth, not uh, Matt Dillahunty per se. I'm not trying to attack Matt Dillahunty. I'm not trying to. I don't have some personal issue with Matt Dillahunty, but none of that's true. What it is that he's very influential on the internet. He's a very influential speaker on the internet. He has good rhetorical ability. People can be blindsided by rhetorical ability, but his arguments are bad and they need to be responded to. It's like Braxton Hunter says on Trinity Radio here on YouTube. We can respond to ideas because ideas aren't persons. So we can, I'm not doing this because I have some personal vendetta against Matt Dillahunty. I don't even know the guy. The issue is his arguments, and that's what I'm focused on. And this is, in fact, the whole purpose of this video is to draw your attention to the kinds of arguments he was presenting. So, without further ado, let's dive into this. And we're back. All right. Like I said, we're starting a new series titled "The Arguments of Matt Dillahunty." This, like I said, this is an ongoing series. There's no end in sight. It's just going to be a continuous series. Every single time I do a video on arguments of Matt Dillahunty, it'll all be under the same banner. I don't know when part 2 is going to come, or or how many videos I'm going to have in the series. I might not have a specific number, and it won't have a specific end necessarily. And again, no personal issue with Matt Dillahunty himself. It's more to do with the kind of arguments he has, and because the kind of influence he has, and because I think that a lot of people get blindsided by his rhetorical ability to a point where they can't see the arguments, as I said in my opening speech. All right. So let's get this over with. All right. This is going to be over specifically, this part 1 is going to be over the refutation of claims not evidence argument of Matt Dillahunty. I'm going to be refuting that. I have found 3 major problems with that. But before I get into that, I want you to understand that Matt is a very inconsistent person. And what he will do is he has a tendency to bounce back and forth between 2 arguments that are contradictory. Okay? In one case, he will argue that claims can never count as evidence. All right? Because he doesn't think that it can be sufficient and able to convince, therefore he doesn't think that it can ever count as evidence. In the other one, he will go and say, all right, it's some form of evidence, but it's not sufficient enough to convince you that a miracle took place or anything of that nature. And so then he'll admit, because in one argument he'll admit it's evidence, and the other he will deny it being evidence. And of course, it can't be both evidence and not evidence. So it can only be one or the other. But unfortunately, Matt's very inconsistent, so he has no problem bouncing back and forth between those 2 arguments. This specific refutation is on Matt's claims, not evidence. It's on whether or not if evidence can be constituted as, or claims can be constituted as evidence. Whereas Matt Dillahunty sees claims, no claim can count as evidence according to Matt Dillahunty, and that includes testimonial claims. And he is essentially arguing that no claim can count as evidence, therefore no claim can ultimately convince. And of course, his specific target factor is targeting um, uh, testimonial claims specifically because the testimonies of the disciples testifying to seeing the risen Christ. All right. So he says that can't ever count as evidence, is what he says in his argument. Now, these three problems is isolated specifically to this particular argument. When he bounces back to the other argument, whether it's sufficient to prove the thing in question, that's a different type of response. Because in that one, he's admitting its evidence to some form or another. Sometimes he calls it anecdotal evidence, but he's willing to admit its evidence over there, and that requires a different response. Now, the accusation of self-refuting that will come up later in here can be applied to that argument as well. We'll get to that later when we talk about his rhetorical problem. But right now, but as far as these three problems as they sit, this is mostly isolated to this specific argument. His prize claims not evidence argument. He uses a lot in his resurrection debates. All right, I found three problems with this argument. I labeled them as the logical problem, the rhetorical problem, and the factual problem. All right, we're going to be dealing with the logical problem and rhetorical problem first. Um, there's three problems of the arguments of Matt Dillahunty in a nutshell. All right, Dillahunty's, I'm going to label these two as memory aids. I'm going to label them based on the letters of his name. It's just easier as a memory aid. People remember. The first one I call Dillahunty's dilemma. And this one is going to, of course, a dilemma are two issues, two problems. So this is going to have two problems in it, the logical problem and the rhetorical problem. And the second one I labeled as Matt's mistake, in which case this is what I call the factual problem. All right, let's continue. All right, we're going to deal with the logical problem first. Okay, before I get into this, I want you to understand what Matt is ultimately doing with this argument. The first thing he's doing is he's denying whether or not the testimony of the disciples ought to count as any kind of evidence whatsoever, particularly for Jesus' resurrection. He doesn't think it should count as evidence at all. All right, so it's important to understand where the fallacy of his reasoning lies. Once you understand, he's trying to deny the testimony of the disciples. So his argument basically essentially is to deny the testimony of the disciples by claiming that all testimonies are claims, and therefore they're just claiming that they've seen the risen Jesus. Therefore, that can't constitute as evidence, and therefore because no claim can count as evidence, and therefore you cannot consider the testimonies of the disciples as evidence of what they're asserting. And the unfortunate side effect of this actually commits a logical fallacy. I knew when I first heard his argument, I mean, I knew it was off. The reasoning sounded off. Now, of course, it was all automatically it was bad because of the factual inaccuracy, because I could tell that it was factually inaccurate because testimony has always been considered evidence. It's universally recognized as evidence. Even sometimes Matt, when he's being consistent, will bounce back and admit it's some form of evidence. Everyone considers testimony as evidence. So it is considered evidence. And Matt will, but when Matt's arguing his main argument, he'll argue, nope, it doesn't count as evidence because it's claims, and claims can't count as evidence. Now, usually, well, I'll get to that in a minute. All right. First of all, I discovered that he's making a logical fallacy called a existential fallacy. Is what it's known as. It's called the existential fallacy. I should have put it here, but I forgot to put it here. It's called the existential fallacy. Okay, the existential fallacy is a form, according to Dr. Bo Bennett in his book Logically Fallacious Pages, or page 177, a former or a formal logical fallacy. It's a formal logical fallacy which is committed when a categorical syllogism employs two universal premises, all. Now, it could actually use any universal premises, but usually it uses the word all, and because it's referencing every one of them, and I'll get to that in a minute. To arrive at a particular sum conclusion. All right, basically, you got two different syllogisms that says all, and then you got a conclusion that ultimately leads to some. And basically, where Matt's fallacy lies is that he's identifying the sum, the testimony of the disciples, because he's trying to deny that that testimony counts as evidence. And therefore, he's arguing that using universal language on a generalized, a much more broader term, when it's more complex than that, because there are different kinds of claims, and they're not all the same. You got factual claims, you got speculation, near assertions, things like that. And not all of them count as evidence, but not all of them don't count as evidence, because testimonial claims, someone testifying to what they saw, counts as evidence. All right, so let's continue. All right, the three problems. Okay, let me again. This is the same thing. Dillahunty's dilemma, existential fallacy. I'm gonna give you some examples of the logical problem that he's making in the existential fallacy. Okay, premise one: all dogs go to heaven. Premise two: all heaven goers are dogs. Conclusion: therefore, some heavenly residences are dogs. See, this argument sets up an invalid argument. The conclusion is actually invalid. All right, the problem. This syllogism is an invalid argument. The issue is over the second premise, since even if true, the fact that all dogs will go to heaven does not mean that everyone in heaven must be dogs. The argument moves from universal language to specific reference to members within that category, and thus the argument is rendered invalid. All right. All right, here's some more examples. These examples come from Bo Bennett's book, Logically Fallacious, page 178. Um, his example is premise one: all babysitters have pimples. Premise two: all babysitter club members have pimples. Conclusion: therefore, some babysitter club members have pimples. Or premise one: all forest creatures live in the woods. Premise two: all leprechauns are forest creatures. C, therefore, some leprechauns live in the woods. All right, the problem again, in both examples above, as noted by Bennett, the argument is invalid. Whenever you move from the universal to the specific, the way this does, it always renders the argument invalid. In reference to his examples above, Bennett explained in both examples, the fallacy is committed because we have two universal premises and a particular conclusion. End quote. Bennett logically fallacious, the ultimate collection of over 300 logical fallacies, page 178. This becomes Matt Dillahunty's fallacy as well. He is making this fallacy in his argument. All right, let's continue. All right, now this is going to voice Matt's actual argument. Again, remember, he's denying testimony of the disciples as evidence. That's ultimately what he's trying to do. All right, so here's Matt Dillahunty's argument. Premise one: all claims are not evidence. All evidence is not claims. Therefore, some claims, such as testimonial claims, aka testimonials, it's also known as testimonials, are not evidence. Because remember, that's ultimately what he's denying, right? And therefore, his argument is actually an invalid argument. Problem, again, This is the existential fallacy, which is an invalid argument, since the conclusion recognizes other members within that grouping or category. The only way it could be universal as if it had no additional members, such as there are only being claims and not specific types of claims. Since the word claim is a broad term and it does include other members, which must be taken on a case by case basis. However, for Matt to do this, it would defeat his own argument since Matt is trying to deny testimony of the disciples as evidence and therefore is making his argument. To truly escape this fallacy, Matt would have to abandon his universal language and present his position as some claims are not evidence. But this too would destroy his argument since he cannot use his reason to abandon the idea that the apostles' testimony does count as evidence, or else admit that testimonies can be affirmed as evidence. All right, this is the rhetorical problem. Okay, before was the existential problem. Okay, you try to understand what the existential problem. His issue is that his reasoning is invalid. He has invalid reasoning because his conclusion doesn't follow from the premises. Now that's what most logical fallacies will render the conclusion invalid. In philosophy, it doesn't have anything to do with the truth of what he has to say. We'll get to that in a little bit with the factual problem. But it does have to do with the fact that his reasoning is flawed because the reason he's justifying it. Because in philosophy, whenever an argument is considered valid, that means the conclusion follows from the premise. Whenever considered invalid, it means the conclusion does not follow from the premise. In this case, the conclusion does not follow from the premise. It's an invalid argument. And it's rendered that way because of the existential fallacy he is committing when he argues it. All right, now we're on the rhetorical problem. Okay, the rhetorical problem is the fact that his problem is literally self-refuting. It's a self-refuting argument. Let me read what I wrote. The problem is this: Matt's argument is entirely self-refuting or self-defeating. Self-refuting. A self-refuting argument, also known as a self-defeating argument, is an argument that refutes or defeats itself. The statement that no claims are evidence is itself a claim and therefore cannot be used to substantiate an assertion. There is at least one claim that is being used as evidence, and that's the claim that no claims count as evidence. So the whole argument is rendered invalid. If the argument is true, then it's still false. This is once again shown by Matt's use of universal language. Would not be self-refuting to say some claims don't count as evidence, which leaves open to the fact that some claims can count as evidence. And that's how you're supposed to word it. You gotta word it. Some claims don't count as evidence, but then some claims do. And that's why I'm always careful with that language as well. Whenever I deal with Matt's prize argument here, I recently did a debate review between Matt Dillahunty and Dr. Jonathan McLatchie, which he uses this claim not evidence argument. And I'm careful to use that argument. Some claims count as evidence. I don't say all claims count as evidence. I say some claims count as evidence. And that's how you're supposed to word it. He doesn't word it that way because remember, he wants his argument to he wants to be able to deny all testimony as evidence, and to do that, he denies all claims as evidence. And because testimony is a type of claim, he denies it as evidence. And so that's basically simple as that argument. Now I understand that if Matt were to word his argument, he probably would not use the word all. You probably just use a universal negative, such as no or none or any. These all still commit the logical fallacy. The problem, however, is that I use the word all in order for you to understand where his fallacy lies, because he is universally recognizing that, or universally claiming that no claim can count as evidence. And therefore, he is saying that. But I word his negative in a way that uses the word all in order for you to see where his fallacy lies in his reasoning. Usually, people do use the word all with his fallacy, but it doesn't mean that he wasn't committing the fallacy if he doesn't use the word all. He's still using universal language. Um, and therefore his argument is rendered invalid, both logically and rhetorically, because he's making a self-refuting argument. Now, in his debate with Jonathan McLatchie, he tried to flip this on its head. I've got a debate review of this. Uh, and in this argument, uh, 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 he basically tried to flip that on its head with Jonathan McLatchie and tried to argue that this doesn't that Jonathan was making a self-refuting argument. Ultimately, I mean, he didn't explicitly said that, but he basically was accusing him of that. And he tried to say that, well, if you're going to say claims, all claims are evidence, then I'm going to claim that all claims are not evidence, and therefore you have to accept that based on your epistemology. Except Jonathan wasn't saying that. Jonathan didn't say all claims count as evidence. He says some claims count as evidence, meaning specifically testimonial claims can count as evidence. But he wasn't claiming that all claims count as evidence. It is Matt that is claiming that, not Jonathan. And Matt would have to abandon his own claim of claiming not evidence on the basis of his epistemology. All right, let's get moving on. All right, now we're going to deal with the factual problem. Now, this is the most obvious problem with his argument. This is the one that most people will probably likely recognize and cling to. But Matt is making an artificial distinction between claims and evidence. All right. Simply put, he's saying that no claim can count as evidence, and that includes testimonial claims, because that's ultimately what he's denying. He's denying testimonial claims as evidence. But testimonial claims can count as evidence because we actually know that for fact, because it's actually universally recognized in the human race. The beginning of all legal systems, including ours, and all across the world, all the way back to ancient times, because in ancient times they consider testimony as evidence. It is universally recognized among scientists, historians, legal professionals. When lawyers are bombarded with personal testimonies of situation that happens and rapes and things like that, no defense attorney is going to say, "Well, they're just claims; they're not evidence." They don't say that, do they? Even though it'd be convenient for them to do that, they don't. Why not? Because they consider it evidence. It is evidence. In a court of law, it is evidence, and they know it's evidence. When they talk about circumstantial evidence, which is indirect evidence, they don't say it's not evidence. They're admitting it's evidence by calling it circumstantial. Because circumstantial evidence is still evidence, but it's just indirect. And so, you know, so even though it's convenient to point those kinds of things out, they don't. So this whole deal with Matt Dillahunty to deny the factual nature, deny that testimony can't count as evidence is factually incorrect. Let's read the problem, what I wrote here. Matt is making an artificial distinction between claims and evidence that nobody else has ever made. Nobody in our legal system makes this distinction, even when it would be convenient to do so, such as when the eyewitness testimony is stacked against somebody. No scientist makes this kind of distinction. No historian makes this distinction. Even better, no scholar, including rather skeptical ones such as Bart Ehrman, nor Richard Carrier, makes this kind of distinction. If this argument was true, then everyone would be making it, but no one does. Every legal system around the world, going all the way back to ancient times, has considered testimonial claims to be a kind of evidence. History is composed of almost entirely of literary or documentary sources, which is made of entirely of testimony. The historian Richard Bachman says that it is also a rather neglected fact that all history, like all knowledge, relies on testimony. Bachman, Jesus and Eyewitnesses, page 5. Our primary knowledge concerning history comes from documentary or literary sources. So taking Matt's arguments to its logical conclusion and assuming consistency, if claims are not evident, and I say assuming consistency, that means he doesn't bounce back and admit it's evidence eventually. If claims are not evidence, then throw out nearly everything we know about the past. Historians rely on literary sources to tell us about the past. Also, Richard Bachman was right about knowledge. Most of the things we know comes from somewhere else besides our experiences, since our experiences are extremely limited in scope. However, if no testimony can count as evidence, then throw out most of what you think you know. Think about it for a second. A human's what we know from our experience of actually seeing it, witnessing it, that sort of thing, is a small scope. The vast majority of what we know comes from someone else. The vast majority of it, whether it be about science, history, philosophy, it comes from somewhere else. Someone else tells us that information because we haven't experienced it ourselves. We haven't seen it ourselves. So we would have to throw out pretty much everything we know if testimony cannot count as evidence ever. The problem. Certain types of claims, such as testimonies, are evidence. However, if the question is sufficiency of evidence to convince, which is the second argument he makes, then it counts as evidence for the proposition concerning that Jesus' disciples had testified to seeing the risen Jesus. It doesn't guarantee that he saw the risen Christ. Yeah, this is getting on Matt's assumption about guarantees. We'll get to that in a minute. Risen Christ, but it does provide evidence for the proposition since a personal testimony to what one witness counts as evidence for the proposition. In Matt's Dillahunty's debate with Dr. Jonathan McLatchie, modern day debate, Matt conflates propositions and testimonies and then tries to accuse Jonathan of it when this was exactly what Matt was doing. Testimonies are not the same as propositions, since that is what the witness is proclaiming in the first place. In other words, he's witnessing to an event, and we're saying that the event itself would be like if I say Jesus rose again from the dead, that would be a proposition. But if I say the disciples testified to seeing the risen Jesus, they were witnesses to the proposition, not that they are the proposition. The testimony itself does not count as proposition. All right, let's continue. All right. Before I get to the conclusion, I do want to reference that the evidence that Matt Dillahunty's epistemology with evidence is that he seems to think that evidence guarantees the proposition, and it doesn't guarantee the proposition. No evidence guarantees the proposition. No testimony guarantees the proposition. Because what we're ultimately saying is that because we have evidence is support for the proposition. It leads to the fact that the conclusion is probably true on the basis of the evidence that we have. In this case, testimony. It doesn't mean that it has to be true. It doesn't guarantee that it's true. That's why witnesses in a court of law can be cross-examined and so forth. It's not a guarantee for the proposition, but rather it provides support for the proposition. That's the idea behind evidence. And I think Matt confuses the pot on that because he tries to, because in his epistemology, he wants a guarantee. He said the fact that they claim it don't make it true, or it doesn't, guarantee this truth. But no one says that it does. But it is support for that. Okay, that's what evidence is. It's support. It doesn't guarantee the proposition. Nobody claims it guarantees the proposition. All right. With that said, let's go to conclusion and summary. Matt Dillahunty's argument is ultimately a failed argument with fallacious reasoning. His argument commits a logical fallacy called the existential fallacy, which renders his conclusion invalid, and therefore his logic is unsound. He is often known to switch back to the other argument, exposing his inconsistency with maintaining either one of them. His argument also has a rhetorical problem, namely that his argument is self-refuting, since it is itself a claim and thus cannot support itself as evidence, since no claim, according to the argument, can count as evidence. The only way to get out of either of these two is to admit that some claims can count as evidence and some claims cannot count as evidence. However, it is factually incorrect to categorize testimonies as not evidence, since it is universally constituted as such. Matt has been known to conflate propositions and testimonies as a way of confusing the plot, but propositions and testimonies are not the same things. Matt seems to define evidence in a way that he wants it guaranteed to him, but evidence is anything that is used to support the proposition. All evidences, including testimonies, are subject to examination, but this does not mean that it is not support the proposition. All evidences, including testimonies, are subject to examination, but this does not mean that they're not evidence. Matt is setting up a dismissal argument that aids him in resurrection debates to dismiss all evidence that is brought to the table. Unfortunately for him, however, dismissal arguments are by nature inherently weak arguments with bad reasoning. As hard as it is to deal with the evidence that someone presents, it must be dealt with to move forward, or else it becomes apparent that you're dismissing the evidence because you don't want to have to deal with it. It cannot be just simply be dismissed because you don't like the conclusion it supports. That is no way to do debates, and that is no way to engage arguments either. All right, this reaches the end of the debate review, and and we're gonna close with a closing argument as usual, and see you in a minute. And we're back. All right. Um, I would like to know what you think of this video in the comment section. So please let me know what you think of this. You think I'm being too hard on Matt? I'm not trying to be. I'm not even trying to pick on Matt at all. The issue is more to do with his arguments and his influential reach, and the fact that again I don't want to put. I want people to focus on what his arguments actually are saying. I don't want people to be so blindsided with his rhetorical ability they don't look past that to his arguments, because that's ultimately what we have to evaluate. And that's the purpose of the series. That's what we're trying to do. That's what I'm trying to do. I'm not trying to pick on Matt. This isn't pick on Matt day, and I didn't take a bowl of internet atheists and shake it up and Matt Dillon and just happen to draw Matt Dillahunty's name. That's not what this is about. This is about the arguments that he presents and the kind of influence he has. And I don't want people getting blindsided by his rhetorical ability. I don't want that. And so that's what this is all about. And that's why I hope you understand. So if Matt's watching this, I hope he understands this isn't pick on Matt Dillahunty Day. This is just me trying to target the arguments that he makes and try to get everyone's focus back on the arguments that he's presenting and not be blindsided by his rhetorical ability. I do plan on doing more videos of this. I do not know how many I'm going to be doing. Like I said in my opening, I don't. It might not have an end in sight. It's going to be very open-ended. I'm going to do lots of other stuff in between videos, so it's not going to be one of those things where I'm going to be doing back to back. Usually, the way most of my series usually goes is that it is usually I focus on it until I get to the end, to the last part of the end, and then after I do that, then I'll go and I'll do other things. This one's going to be different because it's going to be open-ended, basically. Every single time I deal with a specific area of Matt Dillahunty's arguments, I'm going to create a video for that purpose. And of course, I do a lot of debate reviews, and I see a lot of debates, and Matt Dillahunty pops up in a lot of them. So we have to deal with that. But any given case, do like and subscribe to this channel. I make a lot of videos. Make sure you hit that notification bell so you can receive updates for it. But I make a lot of videos, and I produce a lot of videos a week. Sometimes I produce multiple videos a week. I at least want to do one video a week, but I do multiple videos a week. I do a lot of YouTube series as well. I finished one of a debate review between Matt Dillahunty and Dr. Jonathan McLatchie. Very good. Please go see that. I'll probably likely link that in the description box below, so that way everyone else can actually view that series too if you want to. But some of the stuff that I bring up here specifically, I also brought up there in the review. Alright, well, I guess we reached the end of this particular video. Again, don't forget to like and subscribe and hit that notification bell, and I will see you on the next one. But I want to leave you with this, as always, above all, learn the facts the critics don't want you to know. And I will see you on the next one.